I grew up in a small coastal town in Oregon. All around is the ocean and dense forests, and long days spent indoors often make me feel lonely. If you are someone who likes to explore nature, this is probably the ideal place. But for me, as soon as I had enough money and was old enough to drive, I decided to leave this place. I don't hate nature, but the bustle of the city always calls to me. The beach house my parents once owned was sold 3 years ago, but when they lived there, it was on a large plot of land near the beach with a quaint 2-story house and a barn, small in the back. I was 15 years old at that time, and my parents often went on business trips, leaving me alone to look after the house. They always thought I was mature enough to take care of myself. One autumn afternoon, when the leaves were starting to turn yellow, I was sitting in the living room, watching my favorite TV show, when I suddenly heard a loud noise from behind the house. I immediately stood up and ran to the living room window to look out, but didn't see anything unusual. It was only when I looked through the window towards the small warehouse that I realized the door was wide open. Although I clearly remember the warehouse door was always locked before that. My heart was pounding, and without thinking much, I grabbed a large flashlight from the closet, then walked out. The sea in the distance is still whispering, but it cannot hide the creepy feeling from the warehouse. I didn't scream. I just slowly approached, the feeling of insecurity increasing with each step. As I got closer, I heard a slight noise inside, like something was moving. My heart sank when I realized I couldn't just stand there, so I pushed the warehouse door open. Inside is a dark space full of old objects, lawn carts, toolboxes, and mementos from my childhood. But there was no one. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned around, but just as I was about to leave, I heard another noise, like someone was walking up the stairs. Cold sweat ran down my spine. Could there be someone in the house? I hurried back into the house, ran quickly to the bathroom, and locked the door, leaning my back against the wall in a state of nervousness. I felt like I was in a horror movie where things could go wrong. The footsteps grew closer, and I couldn't sit still any longer. I decided to call my mother, but her phone had no signal. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from upstairs towards the bathroom. Someone was moving. I held my breath, trying to hear better. A low voice rang out, "Hey kid, come here." I felt like every nerve in my body was shrinking. I can't believe what's going on. Someone is in the house. I quickly called the police, which I should have done when I realized there was a stranger in my house. I held the phone close to my ear. I whispered about my situation, asking them to send someone immediately. I was sure that voice couldn't have belonged to someone I knew. I tried to speak as loud as possible and put it on speaker to let him know I had called the police. He stopped for a moment, but then tried to open the door. The bathroom door felt like it was about to burst open, and with each passing minute, my heart felt like it was dying. In a moment, I heard police sirens echoing from afar. It felt like a heavy rock had just been lifted from my shoulders. He suddenly ran out, leaving me in confusion and panic. When the police arrived, they quickly checked the surroundings and confirmed that the stranger had fled. I feel like I just escaped a nightmare. They asked me if I wanted to stay home, and I decided to call my uncle and ask him to come pick me up. Although nothing unfortunate happened, this experience left me with a lingering fear. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that I had left the door open and that the stranger had entered the house without anyone noticing. Summer is the best season. There's no doubt about that. I always side with summer, no matter the day. My love for summer doesn't revolve around partying or drinking like many people might think, but rather an attachment to nature, warm weather, and outdoor activities. I make sure that when the temperature starts to rise, I spend more time outdoors than indoors. It was a warm evening in mid-June, a few summers ago, when this happened. I was about 17 or 18 years old at that time. Near my house, there is a very large nature preserve, and when I say big, I mean it. It is nearly 2,000 acres. To this day, there are still parts of the reserve that I'm sure I haven't fully explored. My two friends and I agreed to camp overnight in that forest. Technically, camping there was forbidden and almost illegal, but we thought no one would catch us in this dense forest. We just had to go as deep into the forest as we could. Chuck is the camping fanatic in the group. I'll be honest, this kid loves to play Boy Scout and probably knows close to 1,000 different types of knots. The other friend, Jackson, is always the one who brings drinks. If we were sober, he wouldn't be happy. That's the rule when it comes to Jackson. I still remember the feeling of the gentle summer breeze blowing through my hair as the three of us loaded our things into Jackson's car. The weather is ideal. Not too cold, but not too hot. After a few beers, we grabbed our camping gear and headed into the woods around 11:30 p.m. I can't lie, the hangover was starting to take its toll as we walked. Chuck always carries an industrial flashlight, so darkness in the woods is not a problem. However, as much as I love the outdoors, walking through the jungle at this time is a little scary, even with Chuck's flashlight. After about half an hour of continuous walking, we found a small flat area of land that was the perfect place to pitch our tent. We set up the tent according to Chuck's instructions and placed chairs around it. The next step is to light a fire. Chuck once again mastered the task, and after a few minutes, we had a pretty decent fire. Jackson pulled out another beer bottle and tossed it to me. Then he took the JBL speaker and turned on the music. The atmosphere was perfect, and we talked and drank for about 2 hours. All three were quite drunk at this point, and I could see that they were getting ready to go to bed. Jackson turned off the music and began gathering the beer cans. Suddenly, a shrill whistle tore through the silence. I nearly jumped out of my chair, going from alcohol-induced drowsiness to alertness in a matter of seconds. I don't know how to describe it. The whistle was very loud, but it sounded like it was coming from far away. Jackson quickly turned off the speaker, and the three of us sat in silence, exchanging worried looks. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. We sat motionless for what seemed like an eternity, listening intently to our surroundings, but nothing happened. Everything was even quieter than when we first arrived, an eerie kind of quiet, without even the forest sounds you'd normally expect. I tried to remember the whistling sound in my head. It was definitely not an animal sound. The best way I can describe it is like a whistle at a baseball field. Finally, Chuck broke the silence, gently advising us to pack up and leave. But Jackson and I did not agree with that plan. We might meet the person who made that sound, which I was absolutely terrified of. It was past 3 a.m., and encountering anyone at this hour would only lead to trouble. Chuck speculated that whoever made the noise was probably aware of our presence, which was scary. I didn't know what to do. Staying would go against my survival instincts, but packing up and leaving at this hour wouldn't be a better option. We finally decided to wait. I tried to put out the fire, but Chuck warned against it, saying that fire would scare away dangerous animals. Only then did I realize how serious our situation was. We were miles away from any sign of civilization. It was after 3 a.m., and there was an entity somewhere in the darkness. About 10 minutes later, we continued talking, but in a much lower voice and without music. I don't think any of us felt safe going to bed at that time. Then suddenly, I saw something small fly over Jackson's shoulder and fall into the fire. "It's a firecracker!" I screamed as it began to burn in the fire, and Chuck cursed as he jumped up from his chair and into the darkness. Jackson and I hurriedly followed, leaving all our belongings behind. We catch up with Chuck, who's flashing his lights haphazardly through the woods as he runs in panic. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, and Jackson collapsed and vomited. Chuck turned off the lights, and the three of us stood there panting, trying to figure out if anyone was chasing us. To my surprise, it seemed like no one was chasing us. I have never been so scared. We need to figure out what to do next. Jackson just wants to find his way out of the woods and never come back, but Chuck is hesitant to leave all his camping gear behind. Not to mention, the fire is still burning. I'm surprised he could care about the risk of wildfires after what just happened. In the end, I agreed with Chuck that we should at least go back and check. Anyway, no one was actually chasing us yet, so there was a small possibility that the firecracker thrower was just playing a cruel joke. Chuck is an expert at navigating and was really able to trace our steps. I could see the light from the fire as we quietly approached. But before I could get any closer, Jackson held out his hand to stop me and pointed forward with a terrified look on his face. I tried to look closely and saw perhaps the most horrifying scene I have ever witnessed. There were 3 people sitting motionless on our chairs, like statues. The person whose face I could clearly see looked lifeless, his mouth gaping open. I didn't dare move. What are they doing? I realized that they weren't talking at all, which was unusual. The 3 of us stared for a long time before deciding to retreat. We turned back, but Jackson's foot accidentally kicked a rock, making him swear in anger. In just a few seconds, the light from the fire suddenly went out as if it were covered by a curtain. It happened extremely quickly. We didn't stay another second. We ran away from the campsite again, but this time we heard footsteps chasing behind us. Without stopping, we ran straight out of the woods and to Jackson's car. It was a miracle that no one chased us out of the forest. None of us said a word on the way back, each lost in our own thoughts. The next day, Chuck insisted on returning to the campsite during the day to collect his belongings. Jackson didn't want to go back, but I agreed to go with Chuck. After some searching, we finally found the campsite, which looked mostly intact, except for a stench coming from Chuck's tent. He unzipped the tent, and we saw a dead rat decomposing inside. The scene was disgusting. I realized I should have taken that as a warning, and from then on, I never went back to that sanctuary again. Deville Lake is located deep in the old forest, a place that most people avoid because of rumors about strange phenomena around. This area only attracts those who love thrills and like to explore remote, wild places. The lake has an eerie calmness and has long been the site of many rumored stories about ghosts and mysterious events. I learned about this lake from camping trips with my family as a child. But this time, I came to the lake not to rest, but to find some peace after the stress in life. Bringing a small kayak, I decided to spend the afternoon fishing and relaxing. The lake is deserted, and there is only the whispering wind and the sound of water lapping gently on the shore. After about an hour of rowing and catching a few small fish, the sun began to set behind the treetops. The cool air of the early evening spread over the water. When I was about to collect the net and return to shore, I suddenly noticed a figure standing on the far shore of the lake. The figure looked faint in the weak light, but the strange thing was that he was pouring a dark liquid from a barrel into the lake. From a distance, I couldn't make out what he was doing. That liquid tinted the water's surface a dark red color, like blood. I don't know what's going on, but it doesn't look good, I thought to myself, and tried to call out, "What are you doing?" The man suddenly stopped, looked towards me, but instead of answering, he picked up the box and disappeared into the darkness of the woods. My heart pounded in my chest as the feeling of insecurity overwhelmed me. I quickly rowed the boat toward shore, no longer thinking about fishing. When I landed, I pulled the boat onto the grass, then quickly packed up my things. Suddenly, I heard soft but clear footsteps coming from the woods behind me. I turned around, but didn't see anyone. Maybe it's just the noise of the forest, I reassured myself. But the cold, creepy feeling in the air did not disappear. Hastily, I left the lake and returned to the small house at the edge of the forest. That night, when I closed the door and sat in the living room, I kept thinking about that strange man. What made him do that? And what was that liquid he poured into the lake? Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, soft but clear in the middle of the night. I don't expect anyone. My heart pounded as I walked closer to the window to see who was standing outside. Whoever it is, I don't want to see it right now, I told myself. Excuse me? Can you open the door? I just want to talk. A deep voice rang out from outside. It was the voice of the man at the lake. I felt my throat dry. Go away. Otherwise, I'll call the police, I shouted, trying to stay calm. The man was silent for a few seconds, then slowly said, "You saw something you shouldn't have seen." I don't mean to harm you, but I have to explain. Without waiting for him to finish his sentence, I stepped back and grabbed the phone tightly, calling the police. While waiting, I grabbed a small knife from the kitchen, my heart pounding when I heard strange noises from outside the window. His figure briefly appeared, but then disappeared in the dense night. I locked the door tightly and sat in the dark until the police arrived. They searched around the Deville Lake area, but did not discover anything suspicious. The strange man also disappeared without leaving a trace. No one could explain the dark red liquid, and his explanations remained a mystery. To this day, I still don't know exactly what happened at Deville Lake that night, but I know that next time, I will never go back there alone again. As the youngest child in the family, I always felt proud to be expected to become a fishing expert, like the men in my family. The people who are most serious about fishing are my dad and Uncle Alex. Our house is like a fishing museum with photos, awards, and spooky stories from our trips. And the story you're about to hear is not about me, but about my dad. He was a person who was not easily subdued, but every time he started talking about that strange trip, he became timid, as if fear was covering him. He didn't want to mention it, but at family gatherings, someone would suggest it. and my dad wouldn't be able to refuse. My dad, whose name is Mark, often went fishing with his Uncle Alex and friends like Dan, Jake, and Ryan. That day, they set out before sunlight, heading to a mysterious location that they believed was an ideal fishing area. This place is quite far from the nearest pier and is hidden in a bay that few dare to visit. That place is famous for having a lot of big fish, and occasionally, sharks also appear. That day started like any other trip. The boat glided through the thick fog, and laughter echoed amid the sound of the engine. They anchored the boat in a familiar bay, surrounded by dense trees. My dad often said that Jake was a bit wild, because he was the first to open a can of beer and the one who liked to drink more than he should. They fished for hours. Laughter and stories filled the air, only occasionally hearing the sound of fish jumping to the surface. But as the sky grew darker and the light weakened, a thick mist suddenly came from the water. My father felt like the boat was being swallowed by some force. Rich, the most experienced fisherman in the group, muttered that he had never seen such thick fog. "It's so strange," he said. As the light grew weaker and darkness began to fall, they realized that the fog showed no signs of lifting. My dad and Rich decided to tell Uncle Alex to take the boat out of the bay, where the fog might be thinner. Alex agreed, but when he tried to take control, he almost crashed into the shore. They began to think that they might have to sleep on the boat again tonight. However, my father pointed out that they needed to notify their family, but their phones were in a state of no signal. My father decided to go ashore to try to make contact, and Rich and Dan agreed to follow him. Meanwhile, Alex will stay behind to protect the boat and watch over Ryan, who has had too much to drink and is sleeping soundly. 3 men followed the shore. My dad had remembered to bring emergency flares in case he needed to signal Alex. They entered the dark forest. The phone light was the only source of light at this time. Even though they had camped many times in the forest, this heavy atmosphere made them feel uneasy. As they started climbing the hill, the air was so thick that it was difficult to breathe. A series of strange sounds came from the trees. First, there was an almost whispering noise from the front, then the sound of wind rustling around. These sounds were completely different from any they had ever heard. They carry an eerie rhythm, as if someone is tapping a ghostly song to the forest. As the sound got closer and closer, Dan suddenly saw danger lurking and signaled my dad to turn off the phone light to avoid revealing their location. When the light goes out, the darkness becomes deeper than ever. The strange sounds suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence, as if the air had stopped. I'm sure that in the back of their mind, everyone was thinking about a crazy idea, that they might have stumbled upon something mysterious going on, like every ritual in the forest. Suddenly, a pitiful sound rang out in the middle of the night, causing them to stand still. The sound was filled with pain, as if a soul was screaming in despair. They didn't have time to think and started to run away in panic. My father, in a panic, shot the flare back. The red light seemed to tear through the fog, and the forest appeared before their eyes like a nightmare. A group of people, more than a dozen people, wearing tribal-like costumes, stood waiting, holding wooden spears with a look of bloodshot eyes and no sympathy. Dan screamed and almost tripped, but Rich grabbed his arm just in time. My dad described this moment as their worst nightmare, where the forest seemed to turn against them, forcing them to duck under branches and jump over roots. They escaped the forest, panting and confused, but still alive. They quickly rushed aboard and yelled at Alex to start the engine immediately. Alex immediately complied, and the boat sailed through the waves as the strangers approached the shore. During the chaos, my father shot flares into the sky again. Light shined through the fog, and they saw people standing at the water's edge, motionless and staring at them. Alex tried to keep a safe distance and stop the boat. After the engine turned off, the panting sounds of 3 people rang out, mixed with the sound of waves crashing on the shore. My dad said he couldn't process what happened because he was really panicking. They took turns keeping watch while the rest slept, and they left as soon as daylight broke the next morning when the fog began to clear. Interestingly, Ryan was so drunk that he fell asleep before everything happened and doesn't remember anything about that night. Every time I hear my father tell this story, I still feel shivers. I can only imagine what my dad must have gone through remembering those moments that can never be forgotten. The summer I turned 18, my parents went on a week-long anniversary trip, so I have to stay home alone. My parents' house is surrounded by forest and has a dirt road leading to the main road. This road is a quiet little road with rows of trees on both sides, all at a reasonable distance from each other, so the place feels very isolated. Everyone in town knows each other, so it's normal to meet and greet each other at places like the grocery store, diner, or gas station. Speaking of grocery stores, this story begins one day when my parents were away. I was looking for some favorite snacks here when a man with a shaggy beard walked over, greeted me, and started choosing snacks. In this town, it's normal for strangers to greet each other like that. He picked a few favorites and left. A moment later, I heard a voice next to me. "Excuse me, do you know how to get to the highway from here?" I helped him as much as I could. He took out a notebook and started writing down the instructions I gave him. It was strange that he didn't just do it on his phone like anyone else. He thanked me and asked if I was from this area. I said I grew up here, and he said he was from somewhere else, but didn't specify where. He asked my name when he said, "Nice to meet you." I said, "My name is Linda." He said, "What a beautiful name," then went to the checkout and left. I was driving to get home. It was only a few minutes' drive before I approached the turn into the driveway. I slowed down and turned on my turn signal, then turned right onto the lot. It was at that moment that I realized the car behind me was the black SUV of the man I met earlier. He passed me as I turned onto the road toward my house, going in the exact opposite direction of the directions I'd given him to get to the freeway. When he passed me, he didn't slow down or anything, so it seemed like he just forgot the instructions I gave him and went in the wrong direction. I went into the house myself and finished the remaining unfinished work. I think I'll see my friends tonight. While outside and walking to my car, I heard footsteps nearby. Like I said, the house was surrounded by forest, and this was the middle of summer. Maybe it was the sound of some animal, so I didn't pay any further attention. I got in my car and left, but when I got home late in the evening, a man's voice from somewhere in the woods called out, "Linda?" I felt a shiver when I looked around at the dark night, and there was no one there, and in panic, I quickly opened the door and ran inside. The neighbors all knew my name, but the houses weren't close to each other, so there was quite a distance, and there was no reason for one of them to call me that, like a scary and perverted person. I decided to call my parents and tell them, but they assumed it was just one of my neighbors coming. The next day was Sunday, and I stayed at home all day, and in the evening, I went out to meet friends. After getting everything ready, I walked out, and as I was walking to the car, I clearly heard from a short distance someone call Linda. I really panicked and quickly ran into the house and locked the door. I called the police, and a while later, when 2 police officers arrived at the house, they checked around my area, then came back and told me to call back if this situation continued. I don't feel any better when I hear this. Actually, they don't do much. I am a waiter at a nearby restaurant. I work the evening shift. I left the house late in the afternoon. When I left the house, I was worried about whether I would hear that voice again or not. Luckily, I didn't hear it. Maybe the sight of the police car finally scared them off. After many hours of work, I was ready to go home. I turned into the lot, parked in front of the house, and walked to the front door. I stopped when I heard footsteps again. This time, it was clearer, and I confirmed that it was the sound of human footsteps. I quickly went into the house and locked the door. Then the familiar voice called out again, "Linda, don't call the police. Honey," I shouted, "I need help. I'm sick," and ran to the bedroom and locked the door. I called the police again, and they came again, checked the area again, and then left. I thought I should go to a friend's house to stay until my parents got back. They would return the next night, so then I would feel safer at my friend's house. Alex said I could stay at his house that night, so I packed a bag and get ready to go to Alex's house. I double-checked all the windows before leaving to make sure everything was secure. I went out and locked the door as quickly as I could, then ran to the car. As I was about to start up and leave, I heard something right outside the window as a man with his face covered was trying to open the door. I felt like I was suffocating and quickly started the engine and drove away. He started punching the glass with his elbow. I turned my car around on the grass and drove away. I drove as fast as I could and didn't stop until I reached Alex's house. Me, Alex, and his dad called the police to report the incident. A police officer came to Alex's house, where I again gave a description of what had happened, and also 2 police officers came to my house to check if the windows were damaged. Luckily, my parents came home the next day, and I felt safe returning home again. I completely believe that the man at the store deliberately followed me home, found out about my whereabouts, and realized that I was alone, and for some reason toyed with me until he really tried to attack me. I shouldn't have said my real name, and I should have been more alert to my surroundings to realize that he had been following me that day. Some people are crazy and have too much free time. This incident was a big factor that pushed me to move to another place.